Do you ever feel like today's kids are growing up in a completely different way than we did? People we consider old may think the same way about us. Here are 20 food traditions that only old people would understand. Speakeasy bars were usually these illicit bars that served a mean drink but also had a pretty retro and delectable menu to match their vodka. Now, these things had been pretty popular even in the 1880s, but they really got kicking during the 20s to 30s during the Prohibition era. States like Sacramento had these establishments in droves, but they eventually died out after the bans around alcohol were lifted. The culture of speakeasy would not die so easily, however, and people got to hosting speakeasy parties where there would be jazz music and drinks aplenty, with everyone getting their inner fashionista out there. Dim lighting, live entertainment, these parties became incredibly popular and would usually serve things like shrimp patties and oyster cocktails to go with their drinks menu. This was basically a form of clubbing for people in the 70s, and despite speakeasy culture not lasting the long haul, it was a pretty precious moment for those who grew up on Saturday night speakeasy parties. Another type of establishment that was also centered around being a hub for people to come and hang out at, but without all the partying and neon lighting, were supper clubs. These traditional supper clubs often presented themselves as high-class, premium experiences, even though they offered affordable dining with prices that let you go out any day of the week without much budgeting and saving. They functioned a lot like social clubs, and they were the place to go if you wanted to meet someone, shoot some pool with your friends, have a relaxing drink, or just sit and catch up with friends. They started getting very popular throughout the 60s to 80s, and they offered live entertainment along with their accessible dining. We think low-key places like this are the heart of so many cities and would not mind seeing these return. In the early 90s, as America tried to establish social trends that would serve as the foundation for much of how you met anybody at all in the 20th century, we had automatic dining. Considered a lost art to some that taught people to appreciate good service workers and the need for them as a whole, these were self-serve restaurants that kind of functioned like a cafeteria. You could go to them and there would be a vending machine with different items on the menu being in glass compartments. You could have a sandwich, an oyster stew, or a fresh caffeine brew just by dropping a coin into the machine and serving yourself. It was a lot like communal kitchens in a sense, or maybe the closest that America would ever get to them. These places would also buy their items in bulk, which allowed them to set pretty affordable prices. To be honest, we really are not sure why something so good had to fade away of all things. Even in the 60s and 70s, the love for a good soda fountain would not leave the hearts of Americans across the nations. Small-town folk who do not hit the big towns much, and complete city folk who do not know anything but main streets and intersections would all be concentrated densely around an amazing soda fountain. Most apothecaries had these, and remember the Prohibition era we talked about? They got really popular around then because of the shortage of alcoholic drinks and, more importantly, the lack of a reason to go out to a bar. Bars act as a core social experience for many Americans, and when that became redundant, soda fountains saved the day with ice cream milkshakes, refillable soda, and everything else you needed to beat a hot day. Speaking of summer favorites, ice cream socials were something that our parents grew up doing in college a lot, especially in community colleges. These parties would be completely about ice cream and would have people mixing and making their own cups with many sauces, toppings, and flavors. It was an incredibly fun summertime activity that was usually held in communities, neighborhoods, or college students would set these up as a welcoming party for the new batch. They go back to the 18th century, with the very first one being held by Thomas Bladen serving nothing but ice cream for dinner at a party. In the 1800s, even the White House would have these. I guess we really do all scream for ice cream. While the concept of ice cream socials has now faded away, people are still in love with this dessert. Such a tradition could easily be brought back one day. What do you think? For now, let us go on to the next tradition. People in church need to have their weekly dose of socializing, and people too. And one surefire way that lots of churches came up with to combat this particular stress of the job were church potlucks. Sure, they have a whole name and term, but they really were just dinners held after any service. But the idea was to share the meal amongst all members of the church, which really did lead the way to a lot of familiarity and friendship. There's no better way to get to know somebody than by breaking some fresh bread with them. And these were an extremely common Monday afternoon for many churches and an even more regular sight for churchgoers. We definitely think the idea could be adapted more widely, because it sounds like it would bring a lot of self-awareness and consideration. Luncheonette counters, on the other hand, were not about sitting down to enjoy a hot meal and appreciate the simple joys of life with everyone else, but about a quick and easy breakfast that came with a hot and fresh cup of joe. These luncheonette counters specialized in speedy work, and they were pretty similar to diets. It would be extremely common to stop at one of these on your way to work so you could pick up a cheap but delicious breakfast for the day. But in today's world, where you have 10 different companies willing to dash to your door and leave your food with you, they probably are a bit needed still, rather than just sorely missed. Tupperware parties served as both your celebrity event for the week and a quick, neat, and resourceful source of marketing. These Tupperware parties would typically be run by agents and consultants who would always set everything up in Tupperware to encourage people to check out their product lines and buy some. Personally, we think it helped keep lots of housewives content, both planning out the perfect chance to show your dominating Tupperware collection, while also catching up with some of your favorite people. Often, guests would also be encouraged to bring their own Tupperware if they would like, and this definitely sounds like something very different from the parties of today. Speaking of how useful Tupperware can be, it would also help people with home canning and preserving fruits of the season and groceries. In the 70s era, bulk purchasing your groceries and produce was a lot more common than buying for each meal before you started dicing and hacking away in the kitchen. This led to people being pretty aware of the art of sustaining something and preserving it, and so home canning would become extremely popular. All kinds of meal prep would be done half a week or even a week in advance, especially for people who also had a very active fitness journey going on, along with their 11 to 8 or 9 to 5. People would even pack away entire meals for later, and it was honestly a habit that more families should have kept alive and passed on to their children, as we feel like one of the biggest problems for university students today is not having a setup like this that makes daily meals sustainable and affordable. What do you think, yay or nay, to being a food hoarder? This habit of extending the shelf life of your food supplies for as long as possible became especially prominent in World War II, especially following Pearl Harbor and during the Great Depression as well. In times of extreme rationing, where the U.S. government was constantly begging its citizens to even contribute things like bacon grease to make explosives and ammunition, people really needed to stretch out each packet of everything as much as they could. This led to things like victory gardens, which would typically be grown and maintained to help raise food supplies for soldiers who were fighting, and many of the families and views and children would take to having a garden like this. It was both a sign of hope and a comforting hobby that gave a little back to your home, no matter the era. Everybody needs their vegetables after all. Another event that became pretty popular during times where America did not have to stress about each meal so much were fondue parties. For people who loved dipping something into a big fat pot of melted cheese or chocolate, it was essentially the ultimate food tradition plus social event combined into one. More than often would people bring their own vegetables and dipping items for hot pots of cheese, which were the tradition, but in times of hotter days and weeks, or simply because of a preference of sweet-tooth people, would have other kinds of fondue parties with many different dips too. All in all, the variety helped the tradition get as popular as it did, and we would love to have a party that is just about finding 20 different combos of your favorite greens and cheese. Cocktail parties are something that still persists today, but in a much different form than how they used to after the war, when they were initially carving their claim to fame out as a part of America's cultural history. These parties nowadays involve wine tasting and small, expensive, but ultimately satisfying drinks usually, but before they would be filled with good drinking and affordable but delicious eating. Appetizers like bacon, deviled eggs, or pigs in a blanket, smoked salmon crostini, or all kinds of finger food. Cocktail parties were the place to go if you wanted to get buzzed and full all in the same evening without having to move an inch to get either sensation. Breaking open the grill for some fresh and hot barbecue was not the only way to enjoy meat in the 70s, especially in the southern United States. Fish fries were just as popular and involved large heaps of the catch or the week, which was usually flounder, catfish, bream, or bass being coated in a thick, rich batter and then being deep fried. Typically served with sides or fries, these were a big event for fish fans all across the USA. People would love bringing their own catches or their favorite seafood and frying it up. Think of it as a party, but exclusively for fish lovers, where typically nowadays we only see this kind of treatment for beef. Do you think people should bring back these fish-based parties? There is nothing that screams tradition quite like a God Sunday roast either. This was something that was a lot more important of an activity for people to do back then before takeout. Ordering in and having food in your own room with your favorite Netflix show became the norm. People used to value the importance of a family dinner spent at one table with nothing else going on, and the Sunday roast prioritized that, and dare we say displayed it better than anything else. Sometimes there would be an entire roast chicken, but people would often also have roast beef to go with things like mashed potatoes and gravy. They were a very cozy memory for a lot of 70s kids, and whenever a roast pops back up in the weekly schedule, as rare as that it is now, lots of old folk jump at the chance to attend. Fast food joints, diners, and breakfast joints would take this role away from them, but before they did, milk bars were one of the most common places for young folk to gather. First, they would have all kinds of entertainment like darts and pinball machines, and later even video games. Second, they would let you buy any kind of milk-based refreshment you wanted. Yes, that meant milkshakes you had neither thought of nor seen before. A treat for both your mind in terms of relaxing and your taste buds in terms of experiencing new wonders. They were a popular social hub in the early 70s, but that was around the end of their lifespan in America as they faded out around the 80s. Pop culture media brought back the concept of night diners and popularized them once again through famous television shows. This did not bring the tradition back, but it temporarily flared up some diners across America to open their gates back up. Only people of the past would really understand the craze around diners. Bake sales are community and school events that we sorely miss that people just do not do anymore. They passed into irrelevance as Scouts cookies became more popular, with most kids opting to go on a drive down the neighborhood selling as many boxes as they could. This, of course, was the trend before entrepreneurial spirits overtook children. Bake sales were how kids engaged in some chattering, some baking, and some business all in one. These would usually be held to raise funds for charities, and they often did a pretty okay job at that, but they were more so just a great excuse to get kids out and about, and were a wonderful school event. There was a strange kind of charm that nothing but a dinner consumed entirely in the comfort of your air-conditioned and parked car had. This phenomenon would spawn what would famously be known as drive-in diners, where the entire theme was to stay in your car while somebody came or roller skated out to you to fetch your order. They would explain the entire menu, which often had things like a burger, fries and chicken, or fried chicken tenders, hot shots, the usual gauntlet of top 10 fast foods. Then they would come back with a fresh hot order served without you moving an inch, and it added a bit of a VIP-esque feeling to what was otherwise just a regular Tuesday meal. Unfortunately, with the dawn of drive-thrus, these are now very redundant and a past memory. Those dreamy family picnics that you see in Friends and other sitcoms from the 90s were not really that far removed from reality, as family picnic baskets were a very popular hobby in America for mostly everyone. Making the perfect sandwich for a spring-autumn day, usually out of cold meats, and filling the basket with tropical fruits or your favorite cherries and juicy oranges was the perfect way to spend your weekend, and a really cute outing for couples too. Back in those times, you could not go out without at least a chunk of the present crowd at a park being there solely for a picnic. Nowadays, that kind of culture has faded away because of safety concerns and a lack of park culture overall. But we sure do miss the days when "Want to go on a picnic?" was a valid response to your friend saying, "I'm so bored, what do we do?" A bit in the same vein as picnics, but more on the fancier side, were tea rooms, which were these comfortable little places that would serve a light breakfast menu alongside a very diverse selection of tea that you could relax yourself to. For people who loved a good cup of tea over the usual black morning that so many Americans seem to choose for life at like 21, these were heaven on earth and were the perfect way to go about your day. Today, we have people with their MacBooks out in Starbucks taking care of their assignments and work. In the 70s, we had people doing relatively the same or just spending some me time by themselves in tea rooms like these. If you wanted to get into tea or just try different kinds out, these were also the perfect place to go. A very popular game during the 60s and 70s was bridge, and an extremely common food tradition was bridge luncheon, which were light but filling lunches served after a game of bridge. These would have anything from potato salad to tomato aspic to give you a picture of the menu you could expect, and they really fit the theme. Most people that would go to these were middle-aged adults, but even the youth enjoyed a nice competitive round of bridge back then. The game now is just another forgotten memory in a very, very long list of titles lost to time. It used to be a common hobby of many players, and bridge luncheons were like going out for a meal over chess today. We would like to see both the game and the tradition of yummy food shared over a round to come back. Do these food traditions stir up tasty memories? If so, like this video, click subscribe and stay tuned for more nostalgia trips.